So before we keep going, it is so important that we do an acknowledgement of traditional lands. Royal Roads University acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Cossapsum Esquimalt and Lekwungen Songhees ancestors and families. It is with gratitude that we now learn and work here, where we acknowledge the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff coming together. Welcome. So today's session, Design Thinking for More Equitable Futures, a panel discussion. I'm so pleased to welcome up Veronica Thompson, the Vice President Academic and Provost of Royal Roads University, for opening remarks.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Really an honor and a privilege to be here with you this morning. I'd just also like to acknowledge that I am coming to you this morning from the Royal Roads University campus on the lands of the Cossapsum and the Lekwungen ancestors and families, and feel great and deep gratitude for the opportunity to live and to learn and to work on these lands. So I'm so excited to be kicking off this morning with all of you. This webinar, this is a pre-event for the upcoming Design Thinking Practitioner and Educator Conference. It is the second of these conferences that we've held here at Royal Roads. And while I won't introduce your speakers this morning because Dr. Amy Zidulka is going to do that in a moment, I will share that the panelists you are going to hear today are also the keynotes at the Design Thinking Practitioner and Educator Conference. And I have to tell you, last year I had the opportunity to participate from start to finish, and it was inspiring, it was energizing, it was innovative, and frankly, it was brilliant. And so I know that you are in for a fantastic session this morning and also a fantastic conference a little bit later this month. As you know, the goal of the conference and of today's panel are to bridge skills and wisdom. And so from the skills perspective, we will be providing practical strategies, support to those leading design in workplace and classrooms, and then broadening out design thinking into innovative conversations that will interrogate and consider and explore issues of equity, power, and inclusion. Your keynotes at the conference, your panelists today, really exemplify the bridging of that practical skills and knowledge with the broader philosophical commitment to equity and social justice, which aligns really completely with Royal Roads University's values, our vision, our values, and our mission, and our commitments to equity, diversity, inclusion, to decolonization and reconciliation, and to innovation and interdisciplinarity in all of our teaching, our learning, and our research. So with that, I'm going to pass you over to Amy, but thank you for joining us, and I know you're in for a really energizing session this morning, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are.
So hello and welcome. I'm the co-organizer along with Carrie Robinson of the conference. And just to build on what Veronica is saying, yes, so the conference, we really want to help you who are interested in design thinking, it's hard to do, it's hard to lead. So just those basic skills-based goals of knowing how to do it. But then at the same time, we want to broaden the conversation because there are issues of power and equity, and how do we actually use design thinking to make the world better and not just replicate the status quo. So Carrie and I really searched high and low for people who could come and be keynotes at our speakers. We watched YouTube videos. We spent days, if not weeks, and we were just so delighted when we found Val, Pierce, and Maryam, and then when they answered and they agreed to come speak to us, because they exemplify the bridging of those two worlds. People who have been doing things on the ground, but then have that practical expertise to share, but at the same time are really pushing to make the world different and better and more equitable. So that is what we're going to talk about today. If you could just briefly, could you just put in the chat as briefly as you can, what led you to come today? Just because I know that our speakers are very interactive type people, and it would mean a lot to them if they could see who they're talking to. So what led you to come? If you could write that briefly in the chat. And as you're doing that, I'm going to keep talking because I know that for an event like this, that's sort of a free pre-conference event, some of you might not be familiar. You might just be curious about design thinking. So I am going to not do it justice at all, but I want to give enough of an overview that we all have a common framework. So, oh, Amara, I thought I had control. Oh, there we go. There. So design thinking is, you could say it's an approach to navigating challenges consisting of 3 dimensions. Practices, there's things you do when you engage in design thinking. So design thinkers tend to take a human-centered approach, which means you don't just think about a problem in the abstract, but you deeply get to know all the people involved. And there's other things, but I'm not going to go into them right now. But it's also about thinking styles, the way you think. So when you think about the first one on this list is abductive reasoning. So you're always thinking about what might be, not only what is. And it's also a mentality that you're not going to create anything new and vibrant and necessary for the world without being experimental and explorative. So there's a mentality aspect to it. You need to be tolerant of ambiguity. There's an inherent optimism that you can make things better, or that collectively we can make things better. So what the people who have sort of brought fame to design thinking are IDEO and Stanford, and they tend to frame it as a process. And so this isn't the only design thinking process, but it's one you might have heard of. And that design, if you think of it as a process, begins with empathy. Once you go out and you deeply understand the problem, only then do you begin to define and begin to say, okay, this is actually what's really going on here. And only then do you begin to generate ideas. So ideas emerge from deep knowledge, not from sitting around in a room brainstorming what you think is cool. And then anything new we don't know, we have to learn about. If it's genuinely new, you can't just launch it and assume it will work. So there's a prototyping process of putting ideas out and getting feedback. That said, and I think one of the reasons, we're particularly curious about this panel is that there have been a lot of, as design has been embraced as a great method for sort of envisioning and bringing into being new futures. And on the other hand, there have been critiques. And one of the critiques is that insufficient attention has been paid to issues of equity and power. And to give just one example, when you think about, that first stage of empathizing, well, what does it really mean to empathize? And who are you to actually understand other people's experience? And how do you do that in a way, maybe you can't even do it, right? And so that terms like that really need to be interrogated and questioned, right? Which is how I see what these panelists are doing. So this is sort of a very, very not doing justice to it overview, but I think it will give all of us enough of common ground to have the conversation, and the panelists can differ with the way I've presented, or they might build on what I've said. So with no further ado, let's jump into the panel. And we have, I want to introduce very briefly each of the panelists because they will be introducing themselves in a moment. So Maryam Mohiuddin Ahmed she's calling in from Islamabad, and she is a lawyer and a social entrepreneur, and she's co-founder of the Social Innovation Lab in South Asia. And she's also a senior fellow at Social Innovation Canada. And so welcome, Maryam. Dr. Pierce OG, which Pierce has mentioned before that it's not possible for people who aren't that don't have his background to pronounce his name. So I'm calling him, but maybe you will pronounce it, Pierce. He's director of the Equity Innovation Studio at Think Rubrics, Black-led social innovation consultancy, and he's applying innovation-based approaches in Botswana, which is where he's calling from right now. And then Jaspal Santu is executive VP at Hope Lab, which is a social innovation lab for youth mental health. And he also teaches art and design at the Berkeley School of Public Health. So welcome to the panelists. And let's just start off and maybe let's just go in the order that I introduced you. If you could just introduce yourself by telling the story of your own journey in design thinking.
Thank you, Amy. It's really good to be back in my motherland. I'm usually found in Waterloo, Canada, where I'm also doing a PhD in sustainability management and thinking very deeply about how to decolonize social innovation, social impact, social finance, all these different sort of spectrum of social impact work pieces. But also within that, how do we start looking at design thinking, at systems thinking, at some of these tools and frameworks differently? For me, this happened primarily when I ended up in the mountains of northern Pakistan in 2014. And upon meeting the indigenous communities there, I learned that in this land, people have been growing glaciers for centuries. And when I first heard that, I thought they were joking or something. I think, how the hell do you grow a glacier, man? And they're like, well, it's not really growing so much as us learning how to live with the land. It started as us trying to get clean water during the summer months when the water melts and the river becomes muddy and very silty. And so, our ancestors were trying to find ways to get clean drinking water. And so they started grafting the glacier. And in that process of grafting, they started piling layers of rock and soil and ice, rock and soil and ice, so on and so forth. And what that caused was this kind of really interesting drip effect, so that in the summer months, the water would drip, but the soil and the rocks would kind of hold on to it. And as the months became cooler, so, that drip effect would cause, clean filtered water to come through to the villages and the lands where these communities live. But in the winters, it actually caused a kind of very incremental growth in the glacier. And so interestingly, this land that I'm talking about happens to be what scientists have, sort of geotagged, satellite imaged as this area in the Karakoram, where they're experiencing the Karakoram anomaly. I was like, okay, what is that? So everywhere in the world, glaciers are melting. But in the Karakorams, glaciers have been growing. That is design. And that changes the way I look at everything in the world. So for me, design is not human-centered, but it can be in partnership with humans and all of life. And so design needs to be land-based, design needs to be community-based, design needs to be deeply relational, design needs to be circular, and design needs to be regenerative. And I'm going to pause there.
Pierce, jump in.
Copy. I was trying to figure out if I was the next one to go. Where to start? I had a very practiced answer to this question a couple of months ago. And I promise that this will go somewhere. So please take a bit of a warning for everyone that's on the call and where it might start. But my grandmother passed a couple of months ago. November 26th, I was actually literally in the room with her. I'm currently talking to you in Gaborone, Botswana. And I flew back home to Maryland to be at her bedside as she passed. And for the past couple of months, I have been in probably the hardest logistical and emotional labors of my life, trying to understand what the next steps will be. And it's been making me want to tell a different rendition of your question as the answer to the story. So my name is Pierce Okohile Gordon. You can try, but it will be difficult if you haven't been exposed to or practiced Southern African tongues for a while. But my start in that process of understanding design thinking, what I like to call innovation practice, came before I landed here. It was actually in another institution. Jaspal and I are sibling students having the same PhD advisor, and it started at UC Berkeley, where we started our work. I was leaving a program in aerospace engineering saying, well, I need to change the world and do a lot of great things, and I need interdisciplinarity to do it, and I don't know how. And I came across a lot of people who had fantastic stories like Maryam's. I went to X place doing Y project for Z amount of time, and I said, I don't got that. I need to learn about these communities and spaces in the knowledge-informed, prolifically powerful space that is the silos of academia. And I came in wanting to learn international development, of which one of my fields is, and came out recognizing that there was a deep interest, but surface level understanding of what it means to create novel artifacts to help benefit marginalized communities, and came across human-centered design, design thinking, and all these spaces as an introduction to that. And ever since then, ever since I found that space, I've been blessed to be a part of communities, some of which are the spaces that Jaspal has been a part of, and other communities that do equity design, that understand decolonizing futures, that recognize marginalized communities as a source of solutions, of agency, of problem solving outside of the positions of power that we recognize, whether it's academia, whether it's government spaces and the like. They have been my teachers when I made the immediate mistake of recognizing them as an entity to be served, to be helped, to be only and solely supported. I came through design thinking as a core principle that a lot of humans hold within themselves, that it is human to want to transform the world for the better, for the worse. That's all up for debate. And I'm sure we'll get into those conversations more in the future, but I loved how educational spaces offered a direction forward to create, hopefully, things that will better the world, and ways to do so, processes, practices, and whatever else the world can create. So that's a rejiggered version of how I came to design thinking.
Thank you. Jaspal, jump in.
Yeah, good question. I want to share, as you might already have gathered from the energy that Maryam and Pierce are bringing to this, that all of us do talks and panels all the time. This one, I really feel like I'm in a community with you both and with you, Amy, and people say this and they don't mean it. I actually mean it. Like I'm very much coming to this with the perspective that I have a lot to learn from you both. And I appreciate you for being here. My story is, how did I get to design? Well, I'm an engineer originally. I think this is something that maybe all three of us have in common, is that we had some technical field, whether it was aerospace engineering or law, or in my case, mechanical engineering and manufacturing, that perhaps is still a seed within us. That's how I see my own technical training. My father was born in Punjab, in what's now Pakistan, and moved during partition to India. He was a farmer growing up. he became an engineer. He was an electrical engineer who worked in actually in aerospace, Pierce, and space stuff and commercial aircraft. And then I became an engineer, which wasn't always, what I was destined to be, but I sort of found my way there, and I worked on things like semiconductors, and it was really fun and interesting. The place that I really learned or sort of had a moment of clarity around design was India. So sort of went back full circle in the early 2000s, about 20 years ago now. I was in South India, which culturally, and I say this with respect, it's just a culturally very different place than Punjab. It was almost like going to a different country. I was there with a couple of colleagues in Tamil Nadu, in a city. There's a lot of people there, called Madurai, doing some work with the Aravind eye care system. The Aravind eye care system, many of you have heard about it, is now about 45 or 50 years old. It was started in the late 1970s by a family group of ophthalmologists who were retiring from government service. And as they were retiring, they realized they still wanted to do something. These were all people who were in their mid-50s. They still had something to contribute, and they saw that there was a big challenge and opportunity around, especially around treating curable blindness in the form of cataracts. And so I won't tell the whole story of Aravind. We didn't do anything. We were there to learn from them, me and my two colleagues from Berkeley at the time. We spent a couple months there, and we were studying not just the core operations of how they went from a small 10 or 11 bed hospital in the late 1970s to an organization that even at that time was serving virtually the whole state of Tamil Nadu, which is 60, 70, 80 million people, and was exporting their model to a number of other countries around the world. But they were also developing product, and that's sort of my background, is manufacturing and product development. And after a few months of being there, I realized that what they were doing, even though it wasn't called it, was design, in the way that they approached problem solving, understanding systems, partnering with communities, taking the path of least resistance when it made sense, and taking a path of higher resistance when it was required. And nobody ever called it design, but I had been exposed to design before. I saw it happening here. A sort of light went off for me that there was an opportunity to do more of this, and to celebrate the work that organizations like Aravind were doing, and to learn from organizations like them. And so I'll skip the next 20 years. I did design for a while. It was design in global health. I can get to some of it later, but now what I work on is very much connected to that root experience with Aravind, and that is working on improving the well-being and mental health of young people, with a focus on LGBTQ plus youth and Black and Brown youth here in the United States.
Thank you. So I think what we're hearing from all the panelists is this recognizing, on one hand, that you're all trained in design thinking, and yet you all came to it noticing things that were naturally happening that didn't need any fancy name. And maybe we'll just go in the same order. And for everybody who are non-panelists watching, we have just two more questions, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So feel free to put anything in the chat as you think about it, and Carrie's going to compile it, and then she'll select out some questions that she judges to serve the collective. So can you give, in what ways have you used design thinking in service of social innovation, and what are its strengths and what are its limitations as an approach? And let's just start same sequence of people.
The design thinking is super useful, right? Particularly for someone like me. My core work after I left law practice was training young social innovators and entrepreneurs. And so design thinking made a ton of sense as just like the staple thing that everybody had to kind of go through. But in 2014, when we had this experience of, sort of working with indigenous communities in Pakistan, a lot of that approach to design thinking really flipped. Because prior to this, like the kind of training, you're right? Like I'd received formal training in design thinking, and it was all like, Stanford D School, MIT, Howard I Lab, like that kind of curricula and that kind of stuff, which is super useful, don't get me wrong. It's just that it's very, it's mainstream, let's call it that for now, right? And mainstream approaches are mainstream because they work in most cases. When you're working in a complex post-colonial environment like Pakistan, where there's modernization, yes, there's deep tech, there's all kinds of things. And then there's these ingratiated complex problems, right, that have arisen from colonialism, coloniality, but also, which was, historical colonialism, coloniality, but also neocolonialism right now from, settler colonies in North America and the global North. And so there's all this mishmash of crazy history, lots of complexity, deep inequality, crazy geopolitics, given where we are in the world right now. And then young people who form the majority of the population of Pakistan. And so design thinking in its mainstream forms didn't quite cut it. And so what did was intermeshing design principles with content, with mechanisms, with tools, with practices that were indigenous to this land. And as we started doing that, so one of my sort of many hats was also interfaith, intercultural work. And in this practice, I'd come across a lot of scripture, all kinds of scripture from all kinds of places. And one thing that really stood out was all of the design principles in an IDEO 8CD handbook can be found in scripture. They can be found in tribal manuscripts. They can be found in indigenous religion. They can be found in land-based, community-based, village-based approaches to life. And so that's what we started sort of dissecting, unwrapping, unraveling, unearthing in some ways. And so in that process, we were using a very, very sort of holistic approach to design for social innovators working in complex environments. And so it enabled all kinds of things. It enabled not only, learning by doing, more experiential approaches, but it also enabled this idea of humility. That, yes, you take off your expert hat. Sure, that's principle number one, right? But more than that, you also let go this desire to solve. That whole idea of falling in love with the problem, yes, fall in love with it, but not for the sake of solving it, which is often what happens in mainstream design practices. Yes, we fall in love with the problem for X amount of time, and then it's on to prototyping, and then it's rapid prototyping, and then it's this and that, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that sort of changed a little bit was this idea that it's okay if we don't solve problems. It's okay if we just understand them. It's okay if we don't completely eradicate something or resolve something. It's okay if we transform it. And just that tiny thing led to all kinds of incredible social enterprises that during COVID times particularly ended up in a world where, a lot of different organizations faced all kinds of challenges. These organizations were thriving because they had mastered that transformation piece, right? And so they were able to go like, yeah, okay, we don't have to solve this. We just need to transform the way we're approaching it. And in that process, they were able to support all kinds of things. So from startups that were doing telehealth to startups that were doing food insecurity work and food banks to, even local tourism startups that started a whole other piece around human geography and stories from the land instead of actual tours because everything was shut down. And so that's how design played a big part in the work that I've done over the last 10 years. I'm seeing more and more now, so post-COVID but not even post-COVID, in the Canadian context, for instance, in the housing space, where a lot of my work with Social Innovation Canada has been sort of centered. Design once again meant going back to community. It once again meant shifting power structures, but also shifting the way we perceive voices and actors and organizations in a complex system, trying to give voices where, they're usually unheard. And so design's done some really good stuff in the world, and I'm really grateful that I get the chance to experience it both from a very technical standpoint, but also from a very deeply relational and as a learner from community and from land. So that's been my experience.
Is it my turn? I'm going to try and speak succinctly because academics can't. Whew, okay. What I love about the field is what it does to the human psyche. It empowers its capacity to create new and useful things for others, usually humans. A problem, one that we could dive deep into and probably will, is how much design thinks of itself as a field, as a concept. There is a resource I have been speaking on for about a couple of years by a New York professor, Ahmed Ansari, that created during COVID one of the most formative courses that I've taken on design as a whole, as a concept, called Modernity Coloniality. Just check the website. It is no longer up, but it's up on his professional website, where one of the main resources influenced by the field of world systems theory discusses how so many systems that we're a part of are influenced by the main colonializing instinct to separate the world into the center and the periphery. I'm gonna say that again, the center and the periphery, a very valuable mental constructing tool that you can say the North did this, the West did this. When the innovation of racism was constructed in the 1600s by the Portuguese when coming over originally to, I believe, the Caribbean islands. Don't catch me on that. I want to make sure I get this fact specific and correct, so I can't say exactly towards that. But when it was originally constructed, the intention was to build everything for the crown. And since then, for the past 400 years, all systems have been at least influenced by this instinct, whether it's political, whether it's labor institutions, whether it's academic, whether it's design and creativity constructions. It is to take from the periphery for the center. And this also includes how we design, how we construct. And one of the symptoms of this is its universalizing instinct as well. It is thinking that the methods you use, the artifacts you create, the way people interact with the system must only look one way. And we see this all the time with the way that design thinking has been constructed, considered, valued, and spread throughout society. And it's very, that there's a lot of frustrating points about it. Frustrating, honestly, not from the seats in which we sit, because it is honestly easy to access, utilize, and become become learned, accredited in design thinking as a concept, to spread it to our students, to use it as a thing to create artifacts for the marginalized, right? What about the quote unquote rest, right? So what does this mean tangibly that's frustrating in terms of how it works, how it operates? There's the methods of design thinking. That's what a lot of people are here to discuss. Like, are you ideating right? Do you have the right ways to test the artifacts that you're building on? Are you iterating in the right method? But then also there's the community. There's the people that practice this. And then there's the culture that is built around how people practice design. And we want to make sure that you don't fall into these traps of, when you're trying to do something good, you inadvertently cause harm because of the systems that exist. Many design thinkers don't consider the past. They don't consider history. They think about events that they might affect in the future, and don't think about how it could cyclically iterate, sometimes technological, but many times social things that have happened in the past. Think about any economic upturn and downturn based on too many people leveraging capital towards artifacts that are the new big thing, and then people realize the value of it over 2, 3, 4 years. A lot of designers don't understand the consequences of what they build. They create a thing, right? It's valuable, it's useful. They can create a fantastic narrative about how it's important. But when it's out in the world, they feel separated from those things that exist out in the world. There's a lot of different artifacts that have happened in the world. Netflix documentaries, The Great Hack, and other entities that have already told the stories of, they've created a new thing. Wait a minute, it's had this effect that people didn't expect, but oh my God, we should still listen to the people that created them in the first place. Most importantly, when talking about equity, a lot of these things, a lot of design thinking methods, they don't aim to understand the agency, the impacts, and the expertise of people outside of the design process. There is participatory design, there's co-design, there's all these methods and activities, and they all are difficult to engage in, but a big reality of truth is there's a large focus on empathy when doing design, and much less of a conversation on solidarity with the people that also can have agency for the things you're trying to create. It's a lot more. I'm gonna shut up there.
Pierce, can you check that link that I dropped in the chat and make sure that was the right one?
I got you. I'm gonna make sure I give them.
Okay. So, here's my arc. That Arvin story I told was from about 20 years ago. I was doing some work in global health. I founded a design agency called Gobi, whose intention was not just to do design, but also to teach design. That arc lasted about 12 years. I shut down Gobi last year, co-founded it with a couple of close colleagues. And during that same time that I started up Gobi, I started teaching design. And so implicit in everything that I've been doing over the past 15 years is a belief that other people can do this, that design is not the realm of design experts. I think what you brought up, Pierce, this idea of what the design community thinks of itself, that's a whole other discussion. Clearly, I think all three of us know, I see from your smile, Maryam, that design does think very highly of itself. And maybe the three of us are saying similar things in different ways, but I have always had a belief that the people can do this. I'm jotting down all these notes because I really am learning from both of you, Maryam and Pierce. I wrote down what you had said about design principles showing up, appearing in scripture, Maryam. Like it's there. A lot of this is very human. Storytelling is a big part of what we do in design, both to understand, but to share and to learn. And I think people are naturally very good storytellers. as long as they're not doing it in the course of their work, whatever that work is, their life's work and organizational work. It's whenever we put on some kind of, we're all in boxes now, some kind of organizational frame to what we are doing, we're encouraged by those very systems to strip away our humanity and to strip away things that are at our core make us designers. And this is like a big us. This is us, humankind. So we are natural storytellers. We're naturally curious. We want to understand each other. We want to understand how things work. We want to understand when things don't work. And yeah, there is a tendency to try to make things better. All of that is there. So I will say that one of the through lines for me has been not a through line, a core belief is that other people know how to do this. And I'll see if I can tell a short story. One effort that we were involved with at Gobi 5 or 7 years ago involved a healthcare system in Southern New Jersey that was providing healthcare services to, in the US, we have Medicaid, which is publicly funded insurance for low-income Americans. And that's what this network of hospitals and clinics does in Southern New Jersey, primarily for migrant and seasonal farm workers. And in that pocket of New Jersey, it's primarily Mexican and Mexican-American farm workers, which was a surprise to me. I grew up in Tucson, which is about 40 miles, 50 miles from the Mexican border. And I was surprised to see a robust Mexican population in Southern New Jersey. That's what it was. People call the town where we were Little Mexico. And the problem that the system was trying to solve was, how do we get women to come in for breast cancer screening and to not be lost to follow-up? Lost follow-up is they come in, something happens, and then they try to reach these same women. They can't because phone number doesn't work. The letter doesn't get through. They've moved because farming seasons have changed. And we had a desire, I think, a sort of innate desire to sort of solve the problem for them. But this was really structured as a let's coach and lead this team to figure this out. And they were able to, I'm going to skip the middle part of the story because that'll take 15 minutes, but they were able to, and they were able to in really measurable ways that had real impacts and financial impacts, but more importantly, health impacts. And the change for them as an organization was that they're willing to ask people they wouldn't normally ask, and they're willing to listen to the answers. And that had to do with staff throughout their system, especially ones who are not in clinical roles, because there's a power dynamic there between, say, a physician and a nurse and somebody who's working in kind of a reception or administrator type role. And they listen to patients. I mean, I can't say this as confident as you, Pierce, because you actually were a rocket scientist, but it's not rocket science, right? It's ask the right people the questions, be willing to listen, be willing to embrace like real partnership and chip in where you can, recognize where you can actually help and contribute expertise. I'll leave it there.
I'm gonna have a hot take. It's harder.
I like that.
So there's so many directions we can go. So let's just keep in mind, this is just a teaser so that you all can come to the conference and hear our 3 keynotes speak at greater length. And I'm going to close it off with one quick question, because the people who are attending, I'm hoping we're going to open it up to you for some dialogue. As you can see, these panelists are chomping at the bit to just talk to you. You know, they talking to each other and talk to you. So So the last question, and maybe let's reverse the order just to take the pressure off Maryam. So Jaspal, if you could go first. So Pierce had mentioned that there's this tension we're holding where we want to talk about the big ideas, and then people are also coming because they're like, I want to ideate better. I want to prototype better. If you could give some practical tips for people who hope to use design thinking in service of social innovation, what might those be? And let's reverse the order this time.
Okay, I talk too much, so I will try to be succinct. This might not feel like practical advice, but I think it is, because it I think grounds us in what's important, and that is to always maintain hope. So, implicit in what we're all doing is a belief that some of us think we can solve. I'm sort of borrowing from what I've learned from you, Maryam, that maybe it's about transforming, but there's a shift we can create in the world, however small or big, ourselves or hopefully with others, that that's going to make things better for some people. Hopefully it's not just less painful. Hopefully it's really about joy and thriving. But in order to do that, we have to believe that we actually can do that. And it's easy in the various walks of life and fields that are represented in this room right now, that people are working on different things, that people are in very different spaces. But there's, from looking in the comments, a lot of people that are focused on, let's call it social innovation. And it's easy to get beat down and to think that, what's the point of this? So I would say just remember to stay grounded in your purpose. And part of that purpose, whatever your purpose is, for all of us, it is maintaining, especially when things are hard, hope.
Be curious and don't be scared of being weird. A very large amount of the creative artifacts that we love and appreciate that have been built over time started because of 2, 3, maybe 7 different ideas that had no business being in the same room at the same time. Smashed together, people found interest and said, wait, there's something here, and then built it out to something that could be made useful for others. And you can't do that if you are being judgmental and you are staying in the normal states of mind, states of environment, states of community that you might be used to. It takes bravery, but easier than that to be more convivial about it. Sometimes you gotta have a little fun to figure out what the next stage, the next thing you're trying to accomplish should be. So be curious and maybe get a little weird with it, because you make something useful.
I love that. That's absolutely like bang on. Yes, be weird with it. To the point where you're doing things and people think you're crazy, because sometimes that's what's needed. When I started reflecting on my own practice after what I'd learned and keep learning from land and community, one of the things that became really clear, and this is in the words of one of my mentors, Anjum Altaf, that sometimes you need it to be upside down. And that's what he called us. He was like, you guys are doing the upside down stuff. And it didn't quite hit then how much that was true. And every time that I've thought about decolonial design, I've thought about equity, I've thought about, regenerative and circular, all those, whatever you want to call it, it's always felt upside down. And so weird to the point of almost sounding or looking like it's crazy batshit stuff. Don't be afraid of that. The other one, to sort of riff off of Jaspal's piece there, and this is from the Jewish tradition, and I'm just going to put it in the chat. I love this one, which is, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And so once again, that idea that it's not your job to solve all of it, but you also can't give up. You have to stay hopeful. And that leads to the last one. And this is really from my faith tradition, so Islamic tradition, where we've been told, you know, people can make all kinds of plans, but God is the best of planners, and God loves you. So one of the sort of traditions, traditional sort of beliefs in our faith is that God loves you 70 times that of your mother. And so this idea of unconditional love. And so if God is the best of planners and this God is planning for you, then it's all going to work out. So this idea of upside down, so don't be afraid to be weird. The second idea of do the work, be hopeful. But the third idea that really, really at some level, like know in your heart, you know, it's all going to be okay. And that's what's kept me going.
Thank you so much. So we do have a question in the chat. I'm going to hand it over, and you can see some of the reactions people are putting up. I'm going to hand it over to Carrie to facilitate this next part and bring some questions forward. And panelists, you don't need me as a moderator. I'll just let you jump in and answer the questions that come up.
Great, thanks, Amy. So we do have our first burning question from Douglas. Is design thinking and equitable design practice in the academy and on the ground appropriating indigeneity and land-based knowledges and common knowledge practices in a good way instead of a neo-colonial way? And what's the difference? When is it appropriate to appropriate?
What? How much time we have? Like,
we have like 2 minutes, and I would suggest could you just reframe the question as you hear it? So that just for everybody, because there might be people in the room who aren't familiar with the language of decolonization or that sort of wording.
Right. I'm hearing, there are many other pieces that could be involved in that question, but I'm hearing, does and should design thinking colonize? And when is it appropriate to do so? Yes, that's the easy part, right? It can and it does. I don't know if you all have seen the movie Annihilation. I love it. If you like horror, go. If you don't, watch it. I love it because of its metaphor of the main horror entity. It's called the Shimmer. It arrives, it's an alien, it arrives on the world, and it's basically a geography. That you go inside, and inside it starts, I'm going to ruin a part of it. I'm sorry. I wrote a blog about it. Melding the DNAs of different ecological objects. Gross. But that's design. I imagined it as a large entity that subsumes methods and concepts and ideas and artifacts and says, oh, all those things together, that is now design, because the people say it like as a large continuous blob of entities that continues to do that. And in many ways that it does that for colonizing entities. It divorces it from where it came. It has divorced it where it came from. It can fail to include the communities that built the artifices and the processes that hold so much cultural import, right? And many people do it without even recognizing that it's getting accomplished, because like Maryam's fantastic book that she suggested, Hospicing Modernity, suggests, sometimes modernity moves faster than thought. For y'all that don't know, colonizing, long story short, is the concept that started in the West overall of aiming to take over states, land, and everything that comes with them, whether it's resources, whether it's people, whether it's ideas, and have them serve the support of that powerful kingship, that powerful empire. And it affects us to this day and continues to affect us in the future. How to do it better is to recognize all of the ways that you can build agency and support and clean out the detritus of how colonialism affects our world, that it's the only way to live life. And that's a very, very long conversation to have. But when it comes to innovation, when it comes to creating things, it means doing your best to understand when you're trying to create something new, how is this affecting how is this affecting the most marginalized, the people most proximate to the problem? And a way is to build agency for those most affected to be a part of creating the solution, and once the solution is completed, how they get affected with it afterwards. It's as simple as, there's a lot more to that, but that's a piece.
I'm going to jump in and I'm just going to say, so it is 9:58, and therefore if people need to log out, please log out. And you do have a discount code to the conference, which we hope you come to, and then we will be able to discuss these issues at length. But I'm hoping that the panelists will indulge us and stay for a few more minutes so that we can continue this conversation just a little bit longer. So if you have to log out, no problem at all. We will not be offended, but if you can stick around just a few more minutes, that would be great. So yeah, jump in, panelists.
It's a hard one. I've been told to start where you are, so dig where you are. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant because, I mean, where was I? How do I locate myself? Do I locate myself, by the lens that I'm on? Yes, that's one way. Do I locate myself in relation to the people that I'm around or who are close to me? That's another one. Do I locate myself in terms of my history, where I've been, what I've been, where I'm going? And so one of the things that kind of stuck was dig deep where I started. And so what that meant was, what is indigenous to me? And when I started doing that, instead of copying or sort of occupying or sort of, I'm going to go back and look for your word because you used a very particular word here, appropriate. So instead of appropriating, here I was discovering me, my indigenous, my roots, where I come from and what design means in that realm. And as I started doing that, I started, to pick up on that thread again, I started seeing echoes of what was in my tradition across multiple other ones. And so at this point, I wasn't appropriating, I was dialoguing. And so the question, when is it appropriate to appropriate? I don't think it's ever appropriate. And yes, I'm a hardliner maybe, but that's kind of where I've landed right now. That it was way better for me to look inside first before I looked outside. For me to dig deeper first and understand my own complexities, my own roots, my own tradition, and what design meant in relation to that. What were some of the good pieces of that? And what were some of the pieces that were very troubling, actually? And what does that mean in this world right now? And then, like I said, right, like interfaith work was one of my interests. And so suddenly I was like, oh, look at that. And I made a whole sort of sticky note map on my office wall. And people thought I was going nuts for a few days there because that's all I did obsessively was like look at patterns in the universe at some point. But it felt genuine. It felt true. It felt like, okay, I'm not giving in to the modern colonial paradigm of just consuming, of just taking and taking and taking and taking and calling it mine. But that I'm unearthing, unraveling, not even unearthing or unraveling, but honestly remembering parts of my centuries worth of history again in this body, in this time, in this space, in this land. And so start where you are. And in that process, you're going to get to all the interconnectivity anyway. So you don't have to appropriate at all.
Could I say something on that point? Very, very, very quickly, I promise. In a field that prizes, institutionalizes its relationship with imagination, it is amazing how much of a failure of an imagination it is for the field as a whole to think the only way that you commune with cultures, with artifacts and the like is to appropriate them, to exploit them. There are other ways that have existed outside, and we can and have done them, and we can think of other ways to do it. The question is how.
Fully agree with everything you've heard. I mean, to me, this is my simple engineer mind. Appropriation is theft. It's taking something from somebody else. An important part of appropriation is that, and this type of theft is that you may or may not recognize that it's theft, but it's a type of theft, and it's theft from a people or a community that came before, but it can also be of a community now and in the moment. And I think this is the optimist in me. If you're asking the question, you're already on the right track because you've got the right intention. And intention is not enough, but intention is an important and a necessary part of stepping into this work in the right way. A really, really great and thought-provoking question. Thank you for that.
We won't have time for other questions, but let's just give a big round of applause virtually to the panelists for such a rich and incredible conversation. And so, and we will see you all on the 16th. So there is a pre-conference event on the 16th where there will be a panel. You could see it on the website answering. This will be sort of practical questions on design thinking on the 16th, the pre-conference event, and then just so many speakers on the 17th, including our keynote